So, good afternoon. I'm Dr. Cheryl Dudasic Wiggs. I'm the co-director of the ECU Gender Studies program. Welcome to Gender to a T, our speaker series that helps gender-focused researchers by fielding questions from attendees about the presenter's ongoing research. And I think there's such a small group here, we probably don't need to mute ourselves. I don't think we're going to be interrupting much. So feel free. Sarah, would you prefer that we hold all the questions to the end, or just people put them in the chat, or
I will not be looking at the chat during the presentation. You can vocalize them at any point.
Okay.
Rather do it or at the end. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay. Or if somebody has a question, I'll be looking at be following the chat. So today's presenter is Dr. Sara Bryson, an assistant professor in ECU's Department of Criminal Justice. Dr. Bryson's research specialties include disparities in the juvenile justice system, school victimization, and juvenile delinquency. She's going to speak with us today on juvenile waiver decisions. Does gender matter? So welcome, Sara. I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you guys when the presentation is officially over. But like she said, I'll be presenting on juvenile waiver decisions and asking or answering the question, does gender matter? If the presentation will work. Okay. So just to kind of start off and get us all on the same page, the juvenile court is tasked with balancing public safety and the developmental well-being of juvenile offenders, right? But generally it says that youth are less culpable for their behavior and more likely to respond to treatment options when you compare youth to adults. So before kind of launching into my discussion about juvenile waiver, I'll just define some terms because I know we're not all CJ majors. So waiver is basically when a youth or a child gets transferred from the juvenile court to the adult court, and it's based on several factors. So typically these factors are related to their current offense, like what crime the kid committed, and the age when they committed the crime, as well as prior record. So there are three different types of waiver: judicial, which leaves the discretion up to the judge; prosecutorial, where the prosecutor has executive authority; and then statutory exclusion, which is where if a kid commits a certain offense, like a serious violent felony, and they meet a certain age range, which varies by state, then they can be automatically transferred from the juvenile court to the adult court. So just a little bit of background about where and why transfer came to be. So in the 1980s and the 1990s, there were rising crime rates, and the youth of the United States were deemed as being super predators, right? And because of this, confidence in the juvenile court was starting to decrease. And the general public basically saw the juvenile court as being ineffective and too lenient on juvenile offenders. So because of this, some states started to lower their minimum age of juvenile court jurisdiction and started excluding certain offenses or crimes that kids could be tried for in the juvenile court. So because of this, then more kids started being waived to the adult court. And if I use the word transfer or waive, they are used to mean the same thing. So hopefully that's not confusing. But on the last slide, we kind of briefly talked about the factors that influence transfer decision, right? Offense and age. But prior research tells us that these aren't the only factors that are considered, right? So we have some prior research that tells us or shows us that there's inconsistent findings on which racial or ethnic groups are most subjected to transfer, with some scholars finding that Black youth are more likely to be transferred compared to non-Black youth. When we look at studies that examine gender differences, a lot of studies tell us that males are more likely to be transferred compared to females. So the study that I'm going to talk briefly about today looks at the combined impact of both gender and race on these transfer decisions. Oh my gosh. Okay, so when we look at studies that have been done in the past and they examine gender and race, the findings are pretty mixed. So gender disparities have been observed across the whole juvenile justice system. Throughout the last 20 years, though, male cases are more likely to be transferred compared to females, and that is a pretty consistent finding. When we look across racial characteristics, some of the previous work that's been published has established that Black and Hispanic youth are more likely to be transferred when you compare them to similarly situated white youth. But other people note that there's no relationship between the transfer decision and race. So in a recent meta-analysis that was done, there was a positive relationship between race and waiver, but it wasn't statistically significant. So then we know, based on prior research, that race and gender individually influence the decision to transfer. And so far, only one study has looked at the impact of race and gender combined or in conjunction, and found that Black females had a higher odds of transfer compared to white and Hispanic females. So why is this important and why should we care? Well, the first reason we should care is that transfer impacts kids' life chances, right? A lot of times and in a lot of states, once kids are transferred to the adult system, they're viewed as adults forever, or once an adult, always an adult, right? So kids that are transferred, they'll now have a public record that people can look up, right, including employers. Their development's impacted, education is impacted, and their relationships with their families, right? And we know that all these things are detrimental to a kid's success. The second justification for why this study was kind of needed rests on the type of data that's been used in the past. So a lot of the other studies that have looked at these relationships use data from the late 1980s and 1990s, and they look at either one or a small number of jurisdictions and include only males or only females, right? But then we can't look at the differences between those two groups. So based on everything that I've touched on so far, I did have 3 research questions, and collectively these look at the individual and combined effects of race and gender. Right, so the first research question was, does a juvenile's race significantly predict transfer decisions? The second one was focusing on gender. So does gender significantly predict transfer? And then the third was, does race and gender combined impact transfer decision? So I did use 10 years of data from one northeastern state. In this state, waiver eligible offenses are any felony offense that's committed by a juvenile age 14 or older. So all of those youth are included in the sample. It does only include the waiver type that results by a judge's discretion, so that judicial type of waiver. So it doesn't include anything about mandatory transfer or direct filed from the prosecutor. But still, this resulted in a sample of 56,541 kids. So of course, based on the research questions, the independent variables I was looking at were race and gender. And then you'll see as we talk about the results that I did create 4 dummy variables to represent the interactions between race and gender. The dependent variable was judicial waiver, so whether they waived or retained in the juvenile court. And then I also controlled for several factors, both legal and extra legal, that have been shown to impact decision making in the past, just to make sure everyone's on an even playing field, right? And to make sure that what we're seeing is based on race and gender. So I used the penalized maximum likelihood estimation to estimate my models, and you'll see when I talk about the results, I'll present them in 4 different ways. So first, looking at the main model to show us the differences in decision making based on the individual impact of race and gender. And then second, I'll talk about interaction term for race and gender. So what does decision making look like for a Black female, for example? And then the third way I'll show you the results are race-specific models. And then the fourth, and probably the most interesting way, will be comparing outcomes across subgroups. So looking at Black females compared to white males, for example, when predicting that transfer decision. So this is where it starts to get interesting. Hopefully you're not bored yet. So the main model showed us that the odds of being transferred for Black juveniles were 86% greater than for their white counterparts, which is pretty astonishing. And then looking at females, there was a 72% decrease in the odds of being waived compared to males, right? So that's just looking at those impacts individually. We put the interaction model in with the multiplicative term, right, to see if judicial waiver depends on their gender. The interaction term wasn't significant, so there wasn't a significant interaction between race and gender, but more on this will come in the next few slides. When just looking at the race-specific models, white females had a 74% decreased odds of being transferred compared to white males, right? So we're already starting to see the differences here. And then Black females were over 3.25 times more likely to be waived compared to Black males, right? So at least when I first saw these results, I was like, did I do this wrong? Let me do this over and over again to make sure this is right. And it is, it's just astonishing. So to kind of further the findings and to make sure everything was being done correctly, right, we also did coefficient comparison tests that indicated the relationship between gender and juvenile waiver was significantly different across race, right? So being female and Black had more of an impact on decision making than being female and white, right? So when looking within racial categories, then differences did emerge for males and for females. So when looking at the two-way interactions for race and gender with transfer decisions, white females had a decreased odds of being transferred compared to every other race and gender subgroup, right? So they're treated the most leniently compared to everyone else. When looking at Black females, though, they were over 2 times more likely to be waived compared to white females, but also have a greater chance of being retained in the juvenile court compared to white and Black males, right? So not treated as leniently as white females, but better than white or Black males. White males had an increased odds of being transferred compared to females regardless of race. And then Black males had the highest risk of being transferred to the adult court compared to all other race and gender combinations. And we'll kind of talk about why that might be when we get toward the end of the presentation. So the first 2 research questions were used as a stepping stone for the third research question, right? To figure out the interaction between race and gender. So by looking across the racial categories, we can compare white and Black females to their male counterparts. And then look within and across race and gender groups to see if there are differences in being transferred to the adult court. So as I mentioned in the results section, Black males had the highest odds of being transferred compared to every other race gender combination. And white females received the most leniency, right? They're the least likely to be transferred to adult court. So one reason for this might be a function of increased culpability for minorities and for males, right? That might be enhanced when race and gender are combined together, right? Kind of this double disadvantage. And then females in general are typically perceived as needing treatment services, and they're given more options to ensure those needs are met, right? They're being protected. And also they're perceived as not being able to handle as harsh of punishment as males can, right? And males of any race. Of course, as with every study, this one has its own limitations, right? We could only include differences between white and black males and females, right? We couldn't include Hispanics. And although this is a gender discussion, right, as we can kind of see here, when we're looking at decisions in the juvenile court and transferring them to adult court, it's not only one factor that's leading to these decisions, right? It's yes, it's gender, but it's also gender in combination with race, right? So it is important that we include more racial or ethnic categories than just the white or black dichotomy. Something else that might have impacted the results is we weren't able to include a lot of other legal factors that might impact culpability, maturity, and whether or not they respond to treatment if allowed to stay in the juvenile court. So hopefully future research, maybe me or any of you, can include Hispanics and also some of these other factors like age of onset, number of victims, number of co-participants, right? Because all of those factors impact the likelihood of being transferred. And then kind of just to bring this back to why it's important and to figure out where we're going from here, right? It is important that we let juvenile court decision makers and practitioners know that using data to drive your initiatives is good practice, and it's important, right? Because using data and using data-driven strategies will help us decrease disparities, both for gender and race across the juvenile justice system as a whole, and transfer in particular. And that is all I have for you in terms of presentation. Questions?
Yeah, let's open it up for some questions. Yes.
Okay, how do I see these?
Actually, why don't, if you have a question, why don't you just open your mic? But I'll start us off if you'd like. So I guess the big thing is why? Why does the juvenile justice system view girls and boys differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. And a lot of the research that we have so far boils it down to stereotypes and just perceptions that the individual juvenile court actor, decision maker holds toward girls and boys, right? So there's this notion of chivalry or paternalism, right? Girls can't handle harsh consequences, or girls are victims and they have a biological weakness. They need to be protected. They're meek, they're tender. Whereas males are seen as the protectors or capable of handling harsh punishment, being very masculine, right? So unfortunately, perceptions of girls and boys, as we see, do play a role in decision making, for better or for worse, but mostly for worse.
And kind of based off that first question, and then I'll be quiet for a minute for other people to ask questions. How do these gender stereotypes apply across race and ethnicity, do you see?
Yeah, so I can speak from just what I read in the literature, which is, right, we know about now the chivalry and paternalism factors, right? Girls need to be protected. Boys are more masculine. They can handle punishment. But there are also perceptions about white youth versus black youth, right? And white youth are seen as being victims, or, they just fell on hard times, but they don't have parents that are watching them. Whereas black youth are viewed as being aggressive or hostile or defensive or ungrateful. So you get punished for being a girl or a boy, and then you get punished for being black or white, and then those kind of compound, and if you are a black male, then you are disadvantaged or seen as aggressive or defensive for being black. and also then seen as being capable of handling harsh treatment because you're a male, right? So then if you're a black male, you're double disadvantaged. You have this cumulative disadvantage. So unfortunately, right, these stereotypes are persisting not only in the transfer decision, but across every other decision-making point in the juvenile justice system, because someone is making those decisions, right? And the research shows that they're more persistent at the beginning stages of the juvenile court, right? Arrest or court decisions, and then a little more lenient or corrected, or known as the correction bias, when you get toward the end of the system to kind of make up for the wrongs that were done at the beginning of the system.
Would you say that,
You're muted.
oh, well, I'm not, I'm.
Okay, got it.
I'm talking on Cheryl's computer. This is Donna. And I wonder too, because I don't think it's possible to completely uncouple racial discrimination from economic disparity. So I wonder how much that plays into the ability of people in juveniles in the system to get appropriate representation and assistance.
Yeah, so several years ago, this guy, Barry Feld, came up with this, or didn't come up with it, right? He found this in his research, this like justice by geography that laid out the differences between like urban and rural areas and wealthy versus impoverished areas. And even when every other factor was controlled, what he found was that kids that reside in poorer areas, right, they are treated more harshly. But even further than that, right, we know that rural areas and impoverished areas don't have as much access to resources, to money, to representation, right? And then with representation, we know that kids fare better if they have a private attorney compared to a public defender, right? Private attorneys have way more time and resources and energy to put effort behind a case, whereas public defenders are making decisions, 20, 30 minutes before they're going in the courtroom, because they just have so much work to do in so many cases. So yeah, it's very hard to extrapolate all of these differences, which I think is why I decided to present not only on gender, but everything else, because it is hard for decision makers to focus just on one thing when the decision is more of a cumulative, report.
Holly, did you have a question? I see your mic's on and I didn't know if we were talking over you.
No, I was just wondering, maybe you showed it and I didn't see it, Sarah, but overall out of these 30,000 or 50,000 cases, what was kind of the percentage of male versus female or in your four groups? Do you know that?
I don't know the exact percentage off the top of my head, but I do know it's predominantly male. I want to say it was something like 60-40, but I don't know off the top of my head. But if you're super curious, I can send that to you.
Well, and then of the males, is it predominantly white or black, or how does that break out? I'm just wondering, in other words, is it an arrest function so that you have so many more Black youth being arrested or detained to start with, that it kind of builds that perception that they're troublemakers and they're,
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the racial breakdown in this state is almost half and half. But the arrest function is something that's super interesting, because that is definitely a thing that Black youth are way more likely to be arrested than white youth, right? Across males and females. And that's part of what leads to the correction bias or factor at the back end of the system, because we're just bringing in so many minorities at the beginning. And hopefully we have reform efforts that are starting to target that. But it is a really good point.
So have you looked at North Carolina at all, or do you plan to, or?
I haven't so far. I just requested and received last semester. All my semesters are kind of blending together. I just received similar data to this for North Carolina, but I haven't gone into it yet. So I'm super curious to see what's happening here now that I live here. So stay tuned for
Yeah,
that. Hopefully, that's something I can
good.
do soon.
Great. Thank you.
Helen, you have a question.
Yeah, I just procedurally in terms of your field, is there any mechanism to get results to policymakers or, to have conversations that sort of move into the, I don't know if activism is the right word, but sort of, affecting change sphere, or are you just doing your research and then hoping its sort of dissemination reaches relevant folks?
Yeah, that is a very good and challenging
I'm
question to
sure.
answer.
Yeah.
Um, I am not actively sending my results to anyone, so this, will just be read by the four academics that decide to read it. But I know that there are tons of research practitioner partnerships. And there is a whole initiative designed to target like disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system because it is recognized and known as an issue. And every state is supposed to be, putting forth targeted effort to reduce this. But we also know that that is not happening. So I guess to answer your question, I'm not personally doing anything. I'm not quite that powerful yet. But it is something that does need to be done for sure.
We're looking forward to that, so making some changes. I have another question for you. So you mentioned earlier about how, as juveniles move through the system, that the sort of as they go along, they're having to correct things that happened earlier, right? So this behavior is occurring at one point in the system, so it's occurring at others as well. Can you elaborate on that some?
Yeah, sure. So we talked a little bit about arrest already, right? So that's like the very first contact point in the juvenile
Right.
justice system. And so we know that like minorities are being arrested at higher rates than white youth. And then you get to court, and Black youth, Hispanic youth are more likely to be petitioned or adjudicated, right, or found guilty compared to white youth, right? There's some research that suggests that, and then the transfer decision as well. But then there's research that shows at the end of the system that minorities and males will start to receive sort of lenient treatment to kind of correct for the harshness that's been put upon them at the beginning phases of the system, right? So usually that comes in the form of what we call disposition or sentencing, right? To kind of then give them more leniency. So instead of, putting them in a commitment facility or like kid prison or jail, right? Maybe they would get probation or intensive supervision, something a little more lenient than being kind of locked up for a year or two. Um, I'm not super familiar with the back end decision making. A lot of my research focuses solely on the court part, but there is a lot more research to be done on that correction bias or correction factor and kind of figuring out why that is and who is making those decisions and for what.
Okay, thanks. Other questions?
One thing it makes me think about is once a youth is transferred to adult prison, is there a higher likelihood they will go back to adult prison once they get out?
Yes, yeah. So some states have like once an adult, always an adult. So once you've been transferred once, then for every other crime that you commit, you'll go right back to the adult system. Like the juvenile system just won't have anything to do with you.
Mm-hmm.
And there's research that tells us that once a kid is transferred and goes through the adult system, they are much more likely to commit another crime and to commit another crime faster than if they were allowed to just stay in the juvenile justice system. So I think the current statistic is like something like 60% will commit another crime, which is, pretty terrible.
Yeah. So even if they try to make up for things on the back end with a little nicer treatment, the fact that they've been wavered at all means it's likely they'll still suffer the effects of that decision, right? In the
Yeah,
future.
because once they're waived on, except in very rare circumstances, they can be kind of reversed waived back. But once they're waived on, then like you're no longer afforded the leniency of being a kid. You're seen as an adult and they're going to treat you like one, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm always interested in this question of how women are perceived versus men compared, or the relationship between that and how women are socialized versus men. So if women appear to be less violent, are women actually less violent? But also this question comes up about when women are charged with a crime, how often is it that they were involved because of a male, or involved in a crime where they were, and I don't mean to say women can't be aggressive or can't be criminal, but I guess, how much does that play into it when it comes to women?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I don't actually know a lot about like males kind of instigating. The only thing that I can speak to from what I've read and my research in particular just suggests that like girls, and these are all kids, right, under 18, right, they are just viewed as victims and needing help, and kind of the juvenile justice system kind of acting as their parents and getting them treatment and support. And a lot of that is, getting them away from abuse or helping them with self-harm behaviors or alcohol and substance use, right? Because we know that girls kind of internalize their behavior, right? Whereas boys externalize, they become aggressive and violent. Women kind of take it personally, start drinking, they're doing drugs, they're engaging in that self-harm. So we are much more likely to give or to see or perceive them as needing treatment. But I don't actually know a lot about like the causes of why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah, thanks.
So do we have any other questions?
No, but I was just thinking about this crime in Florida this week where the 3 teens killed a fellow teen, and it was 2 girls and a boy. I think they were 17. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the court process for those 3, if they're treated equally or not.
Yeah. And there have been other incidents of girls in groups doing horrible things to other people. Like there's that famous case of those 3 girls that took that one girl into the woods and beat her up and put her under a log in a stream. Horrible. Yeah. That group mean girl thing.
Yeah. I actually lived in Florida for 6 years. So I'm super curious to see what they do. Usually Florida's pretty punitive, so I imagine that, they're not going to be treated nicely.
Nope.
Okay, there's a couple of folks we haven't heard from. I promise not to call on you, but if you have questions, please jump in. Don't be shy. Helen says in the chat, this was great. And I agree.
Yeah. Very enlightening, and kind of makes me a little bit mad. I wonder what the answers will be, if it's to be more humane with men. But also, I think I'm going to say something that's maybe outside of my scope of what I should say. But Sarah, You know, we all have some power. I think you could use this to send to the legislature or somebody. You know, why not? What
It
the
does
heck?
hurt. I mean, that's definitely a really good idea when I get into the North Carolina data, since
Yeah.
this isn't from North Carolina. I've never even been to the state that I pulled this data from. But especially when I get into North Carolina data and figuring out like who the right person is to talk to,
Yeah.
because the data will be recent, right? And we just in North Carolina did this whole like raise the age. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but our maximum age of juvenile court jurisdiction used to be 15, and they raised it in December 2019 to be 17. So now 16 and 17-year-olds aren't automatically transferred anymore. So we're making good progress. So I'm super curious to see what the results say when I start doing this kind of stuff with our data.
Yeah.
Well, come back and tell us about it.
Got it.
Do you think that one of the solutions, if there is a solution of keeping kids out of jail, is like earlier intervention? I know teachers can't be, heaven knows we're a lot of things, but we can't be counselors in first and second and third grade. But is there some kind of safety net we could set up as a society?
We do have prevention and intervention programs that run in a ton of elementary, middle, and high schools that are designed to do just that. But I think one of the problems is a lot of these decision-making points are based on perceptions and stereotypes, and there has been an increase in offering like implicit bias training. Um, but even that, like it is a good step. Of course, it's a very good first step. But even that, like, okay, maybe we ask everyone in here, like, do you see males and females differently? And maybe we all say no, but do we actually see them differently? And the same, right, for Black, white, Hispanic youth. Like, if we don't recognize that and we don't think we have a problem, then it's really hard to fix the problem.
I agree. April has put in the chat, she says, thank you, and very curious if any of these offenders have had intervention at the lower levels of education.
Oh, I don't know. That's not something that is actually included in this. It would be a really good study, though, if we could get that information.
So maybe you and April can team up? No. See how I just put more work on April's plate there? Sorry about that. Any other questions?
I wanted to just follow up on that point.
Mhm.
I'm not, this isn't my field at all, but back in the day when I started at ECU, I did the purple and gold bus tour for new faculty, and we visited the what is it, the ECU school. Like we have this special school associated with ECU that is a K through 8, I think. Anybody here know more about this than me? Interrupt me. Um, And this school is designed, my understanding based on a memory from before the pandemic, was that this school was specifically designed for students who had multiple, what is early childhood events that are, what do we call them, adverse events? What is
Yeah,
it,
yeah,
the
like
ACT?
childhood adversive.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and so I wonder if it would be possible to sort of track students who come through that school, which is already, heavily invested in research partnerships with ECU, um, towards North Carolina data or specific data on a local population to see if intervention that's concerted and, high staff to student ratio could affect change. I mean, now I'm just designing a research study for somebody else to do, but anyway, it seems potentially like we have a special kind of community here in Greenville that would allow some of those long-term studies if it's not already being done.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I wonder, so like when we think of criminal justice, right? This is probably not what we think of, but it is encompassed in criminal justice. But I wonder if people in the education department are like involved in any of that already. Something to look at.
That's a good point. And April, you have a question.
Let me lower my hand. I do. I was trying to unmute myself before, but I was like, I'm unmuted, but no one's hearing me, and I'm not hearing myself. So what I am curious about, PBIS has been in practice in schools for a while now. So I'm very curious at what impact that's had on um, juveniles entering the system, and of course, location matters, geography matters. Here in North Carolina, we have things like teen court, where if something like that, and I only know it because my son was he participated in teen court. He was a, what do you call it, an attorney or whatever you want to call it. Um, and I'm just curious, like, I wish you could take a group and just kind of follow them along, and see what happens over time, um, from elementary to, middle, high school, and onward. That would be really interesting to see. Because what I noticed having worked in elementary school is there's a perception at that level also, that may impact how children are disciplined in school. um, I, I've seen teachers have very, very negative reactions to certain types of students. And then, once a kid is labeled or considered a troublemaker, like that's it. Every other teacher that they go to will see them that way. And just curious, long-term impacts. I myself have said, and I know I'm talking too much, but I myself have said to teachers, oftentimes the only positive interaction a child will have all day is you. So if they walk into the classroom and the first thing they hear is you shouting at them, or if they do something and your response is negative, then the child then sees. I wholeheartedly believe children live what they learn. So if the first response that they receive from you is something negative, like get out of my class, or be quiet, or sit down, it's as opposed to saying, let's explore this, or taking them to the counselor. I think a lot of teachers take things into their own hands that probably should have gone to the counselor's office. Um, and just curious, I've heard a teacher say to kids, you make me hate coming to work. Like I hate coming in this classroom with you all. So it's just, I'm just curious, I heard her say it, and I approached her on it. And the teacher said to me that they hate me because I'm white, and that was not what it was at all. But having interacted with me kind of changed her worldview a tiny bit. But I'm just curious at how that perception, like, long term, because you got a lot of folks who don't live in the communities that they teach, so they have no idea what that environment is like. And then these children leave elementary and middle and high school, and who knows where they go. And I've also worked in the court system, and seen that. I've seen, judges ROR certain types of defendants, and then, seeing them give, higher bells to certain types of individuals. So I think that there's so many things that go into recidivism. It's so hard to really just pinpoint one thing. So this was like, I jumped on this opportunity to hear you speak. Like, my eyes were wide open the whole time you were talking, and I can't wait to see what comes out of this. So thank you. And I'm going to be quiet because I realized I rattled for like 4 minutes, but
No.
thank you.
Of course, thank you for having me. And you mentioned labeling, and that is a huge theoretical perspective in criminal justice, because once kids are labeled, right, eventually they start believing that label. And they say, well, you see me as a troublemaker anyway. And no matter what I do, you see me as that way. So I might as well just be a troublemaker because that's how you see me anyway. Right. And then, like you said, people talk. And if they have one teacher that views them that way, it's likely that they have another teacher that views them that way. And that kind of just, perpetuates as they move grades and move schools, and then continue on into adulthood. Right. So those early formative years are very important. So it's unfortunate we have teachers that are vocalizing their hatred of teaching. Say that on the inside, but don't vocalize that to your children.
Yeah, I've heard and seen a lot working at the elementary level. So I'm just so curious. You know, so many communities don't have something like teen court, and I think they really would benefit from it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's unfortunate how like underdeveloped some of these really good programs are, especially once you get into like rural North Carolina, for example. Like rural areas just don't have the resources, time, money to do these things that we know help children.
It's true, but thank goodness we have some good teachers out there too that are counteracting those bad ones.
Yes,
So
sure.
absolutely. So yeah, thank you, April, for standing up. That's awesome.
It'd be nice if we paid people to teach.
And then yeah, Helen said, thanks so much. I have to run to teach, but really appreciate this conversation. So we all do. Does anybody have any other questions? I know a lot of other people have to run off to class.
Just want to say thank you. That was really interesting, and keep working on it.
Mhm.
Thank you. Thank you
Yay.
for having me and allowing me to speak with you.
Yeah. A round of applause. Yay. Yay for you.
Thank you guys.
Thank you so much. And I hope everybody will watch your emails for other events that are coming up soon, and we'll join those as well. So this was a fascinating conversation. I appreciate your being here, Sarah. This is wonderful. I hope to meet you in real life soon.
Yeah,
Whatever real life is now, I don't know. But yeah. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming.
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Went really well.
Yes.